If I could ask the hearing to come to order, please. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. We have two who are here in three dimensions and one who will be joining us, three who are in three dimensions, and one who will be joining us electronically. And I'm very grateful to everyone, and particularly to Chairman Grassley for his support of this. We're here today because drug cartels have become hulking multinational conglomerates which stand on a massive international dark economy. According to the Rand Corporation, the illicit drug trade in the United States is worth $150 billion. Worldwide, it has reached as much as $652 billion, according to Global Financial Integrity. So if this were a national GDP, it would be 22nd in the world, ahead of Sweden, Poland, and Belgium. These conglomerates' operations must be concealed, and virtually all of their money must be laundered and hidden. For every dollar of drugs sold, a dollar of revenue must be hidden. Yet only a fraction of the $23 billion spent by the federal government attacking the supply of illicit drugs addresses money laundering and the dark economy of the drug trade. Today we'll discuss how to clean this up. First, we need better information on the magnitude and scope of cartels' financial flows. The federal government has no central repository for data on how much drug money it seizes. What data agencies do gather isn't collected uniformly, nor is it deconflicted, meaning two agencies could count the same seizure twice. Senator Hassan and I introduced the NARCO Act as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to address these problems. Second, we need to dismantle the financial networks of the cartels. The ONDCP must make this an explicit priority in the National Drug Control Strategy, with clear goals and metrics for success, and harness the expertise of the dozens of agencies involved in that strategy. Third, we need to stay ahead of cartels' evolving tactics. Bulk cash smuggling remains a common method, but trade-based money laundering, trading goods with drug money, is another cartel favorite, and they're beginning to use third-party money brokers as well as experimenting with new technologies and currencies like Bitcoin. Fourth, we need to be more strategic. Co-Chair Grassley and I included the Corporate Transparency Act in the 2021 NDAA to prevent cartels from hiding the true owners of shell corporations used to launder funds. I've asked FinCEN to implement this reform swiftly and to expand and make permanent the geographic targeting orders used to block cartels' access to our real estate markets. We must close loopholes that allow drug traffickers to use illegal money service businesses to move their illicit proceeds, as our Combating Money Laundering, Terrorist Finance, and Counterfeiting Act of 2022 would do. Finally, we need to leverage international partnerships. The Department of Homeland Security's Trade Transparency Units, called TTUs, have proven highly effective, helping federal authorities partner with other rule of law nations to detect trade-based money laundering schemes. But this program lacks a dedicated funding source, and we ought to change that. The U.S.-Mexico Bicentennial Framework for Security, Public Health, and Safe Communities seeks to disrupt transnational criminal organizations' financial networks, and I look forward to seeing tangible results. China is both a hub for money laundering and the originator of most precursor chemicals used by Mexican cartels. We need to encourage China to better control precursor chemicals used to manufacture synthetic drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl, and to participate in working groups to combat money laundering globally, such as the Egmont Group. China's participation in this group could advance improved U.S.-China cooperation on narcotics-related money laundering cases. Finally, we must remember that drug cartels are only one part of a dark economy that supports all manner of evil in the world. In Ukraine, right now, a dark money kleptocrat has attacked a peaceful neighbor, in part to distract from his own corruption and venality. The national security imperative of rooting out this dark international economy should spur us to better and more energetic efforts. For starters, we could expand the Justice Department's kleptocracy initiative within the money laundering and asset forfeiture section into a multi-agency operations center. I have asked the Attorney General to brief us on how that is going in light of the recent announcement by the Biden administration of the transatlantic task force they're putting together to attack Russian oligarch assets, and how that will roll these different federal agencies in different offices together. I'll close with a reminder of the drug cartel's deadly toll. Our most recent year's data shows over 104,000 drug overdose deaths in the United States, 400 in Rhode Island alone. I look forward to hearing suggestions from our witnesses on how best to strengthen our drug policy framework, to better address the drug production, trafficking, and finance schemes that the cartels employ. And I'm delighted to recognize my co-chair, Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Chairman White House. This is a very important meeting in regard to the economics of cartels, and it's too bad that almost every segment of our economy or even political issues here in the Congress, the word cartel is used all the time, and I think it just tells you the power that they have. The illicit drug market is massive, over $150 billion annually on illicit drugs. You can compare that to Forbes' list of the world's most valuable brands. The illicit drug market is competitive in value to Microsoft and Amazon, and it exceeds the revenues of well-established brands like Facebook, Disney, McDonald's, and even Google. These cartels mean business, and they do it in the literal sense of doing business, and yet criminal activity. These aren't low-level operations. Cartels are organized, adaptive, and shrewd. They're in the business of making money and will do so at the expense of others, particularly Americans who have substance use disorders. How do cartels manage to rake in cash and still evade the law? They do it by mimicking legal businesses. Cartels know their consumers' needs, create innovative ways to increase profit margins, and strategically diversify their goods and services. First, cartels know their primary consumer, Americans, particularly those with substance use disorder. They capitalize on our demand for drugs. And it's getting even worse with the spread of illicit counterfeit pills. Fake pills are marketed as prescription drugs, but often contain fentanyl or methamphetamine. They're targeting naive teens as a new consumer base to get more people addicted, and then they're around for a long time as loyal consumers and customers. Second, cartels are dead set on increasing their profit margins. What used to be a plant-based business has now shifted to synthetic drugs. And they do that because of lower risk, yet higher rewards. Synthetics can be created almost anywhere, and tiny amounts are more potent, yet more profitable to the drug dealers. We've seen this strategy play out already in regard to methamphetamine. During the 90s and early 2000s, regulations limited domestic production of meth. This presented an opportunity for Mexican cartels, which they quickly exploited. Meth is addictive and can be produced cheaply. We're seeing this again with fentanyl. Because of the cartel's business knowledge, they're lacing deadly drugs with fentanyl, and then, of course, there's widespread, leading to all the deaths of Americans, most prominently ages 18 to 45. It's the leading cause of death there. And don't forget, That's the most profitable or productive age for people to produce and to get ahead and be ready for retirement. Cartels are also increasing their profits by holding on to their dirty money, by hiding funds and laundering their proceeds. In fact, according to the Office of National Drug Control Policy, over 98% of the proceeds derived from drug trafficking remain in the hands of traffickers. Lastly, cartels keep diversified portfolios. Nowadays, they don't limit their business to only making and selling drugs. They simultaneously, like the Zeta cartel in Mexico, diversifying beyond drugs to extortion, kidnapping, and human trafficking, blossoming into what has now been called by officials as a polycriminal organization. They then go on to launder their dirty money, which funds the next criminal enterprise. By having a hand in multiple criminal acts, cartels can insulate themselves from the risk of losing power, profit, and prestige. For all we know about the economics of cartels, we're not winning our fight against them. We're seeing unprecedented overdose deaths, increased spread of illicit fentanyl, and fake pills in the hands of our young people. This is a public health, at the same time a national security issue and crisis. To end this scourge of drugs, we must limit demand and stop the supply. But we also have to go after the drug traffickers' illicit finances. I believe today's panel is more than capable to discuss these issues and offer your insights into this problem of how to upend the cartel business model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair Grassley. Let me, what I'll do is I'll introduce each witness and give them a chance to make 5-minute remarks. And when we're through, we'll open it for questions from all of us. Let me start with our remote witness, Ms. Selena Realio, who is joining us today from Bogota, Colombia. She's an adjunct professor at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs, where she focuses on U.S. national security, illicit networks, transnational organized crime, counterterror, and other national security issues. A former U.S. diplomat, international banker with Goldman Sachs, State Department Director of Counterterrorism Finance Programs, consultant and professor at the National Defense George Washington and Joint Special Operations Universities, Professor Realio has over 2 decades of international experience in the public, private, and academic sectors and has been a trusted strategic advisor to senior leaders in U.S. government, military, business, and academia, and we're delighted that she could join us today from overseas. Professor Realio, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me, sir?
Hear you well.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse and Chairman Grassley, as well as the members of the Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control, for this opportunity to testify today, countering the evolving drug trade and the digitalization of illicit networks in the Americas. I really appreciate the ability to accommodate my schedule. I'm in Bogota, Colombia, actually conducting a seminar for the Colombian National War College on these very threats of transnational organized crime and illicit financial flows. During the pandemic, transnational criminal organizations, such as the Mexican cartels, have quickly adapted to a changing environment and leveraged cyberspace to empower and further enrich themselves. My testimony today will examine the transforming drug market, the U.S. opioid epidemic, and cyberspace as a force multiplier for both drug trafficking and money laundering, and actually make specific recommendations to counter the illicit economy. The drug trade in the Americas has been evolving from a plant-based narcotics like cocaine and heroin to potent synthetic drugs like fentanyl and methamphetamine. As already mentioned, the U.S. drug consumption has shifted significantly to opioids, resulting in an unprecedented epidemic in the U.S. with exactly 288 drug overdose deaths in the past 12 months, recorded in September of 2021, according to the CDC. As U.S. cocaine consumption falls, cocaine traffickers have expanded to new routes and new markets in Asia and in Europe, where they can actually double or triple their profits. They have totally gone global, engaged in circumnavigating the world and stepping up their use of submarines. Meanwhile, the Mexican cartels are increasingly trafficking deadly opioids into the United States. Cartel Jalisco, Nueva Generación, the Sinaloa Cartel, and the Gulf Cartel are among the most powerful and dangerous TCOs in Mexico that affect the national security of the United States. Increased competition among the cartels has resulted in near record levels of violence in Mexico, with 33,308 homicides last year. The cartels have remained active, trafficking lethal drugs like fentanyl, heroin, meth, and cocaine in the United States, despite the COVID-19 lockdowns and closed borders and paralyzed international trade over the past 2 years. They've also taken advantage of the fact that governments have been so focused on pandemic response, they've actually neglected, in some cases, in their mission to fight crime. These groups are expanding their control of trafficking routes and markets and are even winning the hearts and minds by providing social services to marginalized communities in Mexico. Technology and the internet have supercharged illicit drug markets and related illicit financial flows. The cartels have been using online markets and cryptocurrencies to promote, sell, and profit from the drug trade. The darknet actually provides anonymity, efficiency, ease of payment through cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and convenient direct drug delivery by mail to consumers. In a very disturbing development, TCOs are targeting our youth, using social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram to market narcotics, glorify the narco lifestyle, and even recruit our young people into their groups. What we've seen with the pandemic has been an acceleration of what we call the use of the cyber-physical realm or domain. All the activities that we'd seen in the past that take place in real life have now been complemented with activities in cyberspace. To counter the evolving drug trade and digitalization of illicit networks, US and partner nations must intensify demand and supply reduction, drug detection and interdiction, and adopt counter money laundering and cyber measures to keep up with the rapid changes in the production, marketing, financing, and delivery of drugs, particularly synthetic drugs. I would recommend the following measures to counter the illicit economy. Number one, permanently place fentanyl-related substances into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act to empower our law enforcement. Number two, actively educate Americans of all age groups of the dangers from fentanyl-laced counterfeit drugs and opioids. Number three, monitor and control online drug markets and the social media platforms used to promote drug use and sales, especially to our minors, and consider duty of care requirements, reducing the risk of harm to users. Number four, revitalize US-Mexican cooperation to curb drug production, trafficking, and the laundering of TCO's proceeds. Number five, detect, disrupt, and prosecute Chinese fentanyl and precursor chemical traffickers and their money laundering networks. Number six, leverage digital and financial intelligence to detect and disrupt the use of cryptocurrencies and prevent the exploitation of newly emerging financial services such as e-wallets. And number seven, to complement our chairman's comments, work with our partner countries to share best practices regarding evolving money laundering schemes and the transformation of the drug market into what we call the cyber-physical realm. Thank you so much for your attention, and more importantly, I will stand ready for all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm grateful to you and appreciate the trouble you've taken to come in from overseas. Our next witness is Michael McDaniel, who began his law enforcement career in 1983 as a police officer. Senator Cornyn will be glad to hear, with the City of Houston Police Department. He then became a special agent with DEA, working domestic and international cases, and served as staff coordinator in the Southwest Border section of the Special Operations Division. As group supervisor of DEA's San Antonio high-intensity drug trafficking area, we call those HIDAs, a resident agent in charge in southern New Mexico, and assistant special agent in charge in the Houston DEA office, again, Cornyn country. In September of 2011, Mr. McDaniel retired from DEA to accept a position as the Houston HIDA director, where he has served since. Mr. McDaniel, welcome and thank you for your service. Please proceed.
Thank you, sir. thank you to the committee for this opportunity. Uh, This committee is really important to and the work that you guys do is really important to the 33 HIDAs across the country. I know that this committee is very familiar with the HIDA program, and I would add that it's been amazing to see what happens, and this will be part of this committee's strategy. It's amazing to see what happens when you put state, local, federal, and tribal agencies, law enforcement agencies in one room, give them an equal voice, and let them all figure out how they're going to attack the regional drug problem. And it's just been amazing to watch. And I think that'll be part of this committee strategy today. The techniques, I was asked to ask about the techniques that we're using, and they're the traditional investigative techniques that we're using. They'll go into three categories, into intelligence, into investigative methods, and then lastly, technology. And for the investigative piece, HIDA is mandated to put analytical support centers in all the HIDAs across the nation, and some HIDAs have more than one, especially those multi-state HIDAs. Those centers are very, very helpful to drug law enforcement, not just to the HIDA initiatives, but also to all the law enforcement agencies in that region. We are looking, and the last witness has actually talked about it, but ONDCP and the HIDAs have been looking of late at some investigative contracting services that are helping us look at some other, some computer algorithm companies that will help us actually make a bigger attack on the money laundering organizations and of the distribution cartel aspect of it. And so we're going to be looking at that as well, because I think, as you guys can imagine, in the technology sector, although HIDA will purchase a lot of equipment like advanced covert surveillance equipment, GPS trackers, different handheld X-ray scanners to see like anomalies and things in the vehicles on the highway. But more importantly, the Title III wire intercepts in the past have been our biggest tool. And now the challenges we face, as the last witness mentioned, about the apps like Signal and Trent and some of the app things that are actually putting us in the dark. And I know this committee has actually heard testimony about the going dark issue, but I would ask this committee to, again, renew that, because it's amazing how little we're getting on our Title III wire intercepts. It's a challenge. And maybe this committee actually, if you guys have any input, look at the lawful access. We talked to some of the cell phone providers and some of the providers. They say, we really actually want to help you guys, but we have to be mandated to do so, because I can't lose that competitive edge to another person, to another cellular telephone company or whatever the likes may be. And I want you to visualize, just last week in Montgomery County, and this happens every week, you can imagine, we talk about the counterfeit pills, and our HIDA task force guys show up at an overdose death of a college student, and the family is sitting there, and they're handing the officers the cell phone and saying, please, figure out who's actually distributing lethal amounts of these counterfeit pills. We actually can't even open that cell phone because the parents don't know the password. So anything these cellular companies can do would be greatly appreciated by by this committee. We also, as far as the money laundering, I'll kind of counter some of the things that all the witnesses are going to be talking about, but the Chinese money laundering organizations that are now doing pickups here in the U.S. We're actually doing surveillance and watching Chinese nationals meeting with cartel cell heads in different cities, and we're seeing situations where they're picking up large amounts of bulk currency. And so that's right now, that's off our radar. We actually don't get to see that. And the best chance we have of interdicting that is seizing it as the guys are going down the highway. Well, in fact, last week in Alabama, they seized $1.4 million from 4 Asian nationals driving an 18-wheeler in Mississippi, and it looked like it was going to the southwest border. One of the The last things I'll talk about is whatever this committee can do, we really appreciate your efforts, and you have the resources of all the 33 HIDAs across the country at your disposal, and we're looking forward to working with you and your staff on coming up with good solutions of how we can tackle this problem. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Agent McDaniel. Our next witness is Lakshmi Kumar, the Policy Director at Global Financial Integrity, whose work I cited in my opening remarks. She has vast experience in financial policy, securities investigation, regulatory governance, anti-corruption, and anti-money laundering terrorist financing. Prior to joining GFI, Ms. Kumar worked with governments and regulatory agencies across South Asia, East Africa, and Eurasia to investigate money laundering and terrorist financing risks to financial systems, including drafting legislation to identify beneficial ownership for the financial sector in India, evaluating the robustness of the securities market in the Eurasian region, and conducting investigations on sovereign wealth funds, procurement procedures, and other offshore investment entities to evaluate fraud and terror financing risks. Welcome, Ms. Kumar. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman, White House Co-Chair Grassley, and other members of the caucus. It is a privilege to testify before you today on the critical issue before us. My name is Lakshmi Kumar, and I'm the Policy Director at Global Financial Integrity, a think tank focused on providing evidence-based research and solutions to counter the ways in which criminal actors abuse the U.S. economy to hide their illicit profits. Through this testimony, I hope to also demonstrate that allowing the U.S. to act as a safe haven for the illicit profits of cartels has direct costs to both U.S. national security and the everyday well-being of U.S. citizens. The U.S. today is the world's largest consumer of illegal drugs. A report from the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization found that the U.S. makes up just 5% of the global population, yet accounts for over 25% of global demand for illicit drugs. Since 1971, the U.S. has spent over $1 trillion enforcing its drug policy, yet the number of illicit drug users rose to 13% of the U.S. population in 2019, which is close to its peak from over 40 years ago. While this testimony and recommendations contained here focus on how to bolster the use of financial tools in the U.S. context, a truly cohesive policy framework needs to span jurisdictions that serve as production, transit, and destination countries. No region better exemplifies this than Central America. By 2015, the U.S. government estimated that 90% of cocaine trafficked into the United States moved along the Central American and Mexico corridor, geographically meaning that it necessitates moving through Guatemala. Transshipment points extend well beyond the Western Hemisphere. For instance, cartels have used the West African country of Guinea-Bissau as a transit hub for cocaine. The country, through poverty and corruption, is now a narco state. In 2008, the country did not have a prison, had one patrol boat to patrol 217 miles of coastline. Yet nearly a decade later, very little has improved. In 2019, police in Guinea-Bissau seized 1.8 metric tons of cocaine, the largest seizure in the country's history. Laundering the proceeds is the other side of this coin. As a cash-intensive business, an ongoing challenge is to always find new and innovative ways to integrate these proceeds into the financial system. GFI's 2019 report submitted to Congress identified trade-based money laundering and bulk cash smuggling as the most common method. Yet the reality is, cartels innovate and look at the long-term horizons of their business. GFI has found systematic examples of investment into the private equity markets, real estate, renewable energy, jewelry, art, cryptocurrency. All of this has costs. A rather telling example was the recent collapse of the Miami condo building last year, killing 98 people. Investigative reports found that the building was built in the heydays of the cocaine cartel, and developers cut costs to benefit from the cocaine boom and sell apartments to drug traffickers looking for an easy way to launder money. Stronger financial transparency tools and beneficial ownership is not just needed in the real estate sector, but across a variety of asset classes and the financial and trade-based mechanisms that are exploited by cartel actors. Historically, policy efforts have prioritized the dismantling of structures and networks of criminal actors in the drug trade. Financial and trade tools will always be critical to this approach. However, I would be remiss in failing to point out the multidimensional nature of this problem, which has deep connections to intrinsic corruption, weak democracies, poverty, and the need for sustainable livelihoods. The effectiveness and value of financial tools, therefore, go hand in hand with finding ways these multidimensional issues intersect with each other. The question, therefore, before us is, what can Congress do? And I have 3 key recommendations on this. First, FinCEN should prioritize the creation of a permanent and nationwide rule that applies to the commercial and residential real estate sector and follows a cascading reporting structure. Second, FinCEN should be given the additional funding that is needed to meet the ambitious goals both before this caucus and as suggested by the Biden administration. Finally, on the TBML front, while the TTUs have been successful, more can be done to share information with source, transit, and destination countries, including beneficial ownership information that is not currently shared, setting up a designated task force for TBML within FinCEN, and using advocacy efforts to ensure that there is a TBML standard set at the Financial Action Task Force level. Thank you again for your time today, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kumar. That was very helpful. I appreciate it. Ms. Hanicek is the Government Affairs Director at the FACT Coalition, where she leads the group's federal policy work. Before joining FACT, Ms. Hanicek worked with U.S.-based nonprofits on advancing transparent governance, accountability, and rule of law in the Middle East. From 2017 to 2020, she served as Government Relations Director at Americans for a Free Syria, where she partnered with lawmakers, administration officials, and other nonprofit organizations on legislation targeting the networks that fuel mass human rights violations in Syria and the region. She likewise campaigned to augment counter-terror finance measures and prevent the diversion and abuse of U.S. humanitarian aid. And we're delighted she is with us. Ms. Hanicek.
Thank you so much. Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chairman Grassley, all, thank you for holding this important hearing. It's critical that Congress deny drug traffickers the financial tools that they use to bury their financial gains. I'm here on behalf of the FACT Coalition and its more than 100 civil society, business, and labor members to discuss bipartisan reforms to counter the U.S. financial secrecy that fuels the public health harms, economic distortion, and corruption perpetuated by the drug trade. In my testimony, I will highlight 3 ways in which Congress can tackle U.S. financial secrecy. Congress should, 1, encourage the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to fully implement existing anti-money laundering laws. 2, pass legislation requiring additional due diligence by opaque financial sectors. And 3, fund FinCEN at levels to ensure the agency has the staff and resources necessary to fulfill its ambitious anti-money laundering and anti-corruption mission. Secretary of U.S. Treasury Janet Yellen stated the problem clearly in a speech in December. Right now, the best place to hide and launder ill-gotten gains is actually the United States. This is shocking. Americans usually think this illicit activity only happens in places like the Cayman Islands. As the world's largest economy and one of the most opaque, the United States is a leading destination for drug traffickers and the corrupt officials they work with to park their illicit funds. While my written testimony discusses several vulnerabilities, I will use this time to address just 2: anonymous U.S. shell entities and the role of professional enabling industries, such as the U.S. private investment sector. U.S. anonymous shell entities pose an immense money laundering risk. More personal information is required to obtain a library card in all 50 states than it takes to establish a legal entity that can be used to facilitate drug trafficking, money laundering, and corruption. This isn't an abstract risk. Just in the past 2 weeks, New York-based money launderer Da Yingze pled guilty to laundering $653 million in drug money through shell companies with bank accounts in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, then remitting the illicit money back to China and Hong Kong. We further know that U.S. anonymous entities play a role in fueling drug networks' efforts to strategically corrupt societies and governments. A report by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime found that anonymous entities were used to hide the proceeds of corruption in the majority of grand corruption cases, with U.S. entities being the most common. Congress has already taken a critical step to address this problem. Last year, Congress passed the Bipartisan Corporate Transparency Act, referenced by the chairman, which would effectively end the abuse of anonymous shell entities by requiring certain entities to name their true owner to FinCEN. The Treasury Department is diligently working to implement this law, but to date, none of its 3 anticipated rules are finalized. These rules must be finalized by the end of 2022. Next, it's imperative that the U.S. bring enablers of crime and corruption under its anti-money laundering laws. While anonymous entities often act as the getaway vehicle for financial crimes, certain industry professionals can serve as the getaway driver. Drug trafficking organizations rely on these professionals to understand and gain access to the U.S. financial system. The Financial Action Task Force found that the United States was completely deficient and well behind international norms in regulating these enabling professions in its most recent comprehensive evaluation. The administration already has the authority and stated will to tackle one gaping loophole in our system, the opaque $11 trillion private investment industry. Unlike banks and broker-dealers, which perform similar functions in the securities market, none of the private equity, hedge funds, venture capital firms, or their investment advisors currently have any obligations under U.S. anti-money laundering laws. The opacity of this sector led the FBI to conclude, with high confidence, that the private investment market is increasingly a vehicle for money laundering and sanctions evasion. In one such case, Mexican drug cartels in California used hedge funds to launder $1 million a week. In a similar case, a boutique investment firm in Florida allegedly laundered more than $100 million through high-end U.S. real estate as part of the black market peso exchange. Access to private investment vehicles or other U.S. financial vehicles do not occur in a vacuum. Other financial professionals are critical. The United States is in the last 10% of countries that have not taken steps of requiring business professionals like lawyers, accountants, and other trust and company service agents to conduct anti-money laundering due diligence. The risks to these sectors demand further legislative action by Congress. So, what can Congress do? Congress should pursue financial reforms to help investigators follow the money fueling the transnational drug trade. Such reforms will have follow-on effects, including improving the enforcement of U.S. sanctions. As Congress considers how to respond to Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine, I am sure this is top of mind. Here are 3 recommendations, in addition to those outlined by Ms. Kumar, that Congress must pursue to keep Americans safe and uphold the integrity of our systems. First, Congress must fulfill its oversight role to ensure existing anti-money laundering laws are fully implemented. Co-chairs, I thank you for your leadership in supporting the Corporate Transparency Act. The first rule proposed by FinCEN was strong, and with yours and other inputs, will ensure meaningful disclosures of an entity's true owner. Still, members of this caucus should continue engaging FinCEN regarding how law enforcement can gain access to this database. Congress should urge FinCEN to craft protocols that guarantee timely and uncomplicated database access for state, local, and federal law enforcement. Further, access protocols must be written to facilitate international cooperation, including in narcotics cases. In a similar fashion, Congress should encourage FinCEN to follow through on the administration's stated commitment to meaningfully bring the U.S. private investment sector and other under U.S. money laundering regulations as a way to crack down on illicit narcotics trafficking. Second, Congress will need to take action to bring transparency to enabler professions. Congress should advance legislation such as the Enablers Act or successor legislation to require professionals such as lawyers, accountants, or corporate and trust service agents to fulfill basic anti-money laundering checks. And then finally, there is one thing that only Congress can and must do: fund the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It's imperative that Congress supply the agency with the resources and the staffing necessary to do its job. Congress must finally approve a budget that meets the Biden administration's request to increase the agency's funding by 50%. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. This has been really helpful. Let me start with a question for Ms. Realio about what we should be pursuing diplomatically and through trade pressure by way of anti-corruption reforms in other countries that are either producing or transit countries. There's a link between corruption at home and participation in these illegal narcotics finance schemes. And what should the standard be that we demand of our trade partners that are engaged in this?
That's such a great question, and it's actually quite timely because the White House has actually issued a strategy to counter corruption throughout the world as part of one of the pillars of U.S. foreign policy. We've actually seen, where we take a look at transnational criminal organizations, they choose and actually aid and abet corrupt regimes where they can freely and, more importantly, actually dominate, if not actually corrupt or co-opt the governments that help them. This is particularly true, as we've seen, sadly, in the case of Guatemala and in Honduras, where the most recent president is now arrested for having ties with narcotics trafficking based on a U.S. case. What needs to be done is we have to hold our partners accountable. And we've seen this in terms of the way the U.S. assigns and, more importantly, appropriates U.S. foreign assistance to actually try to establish what we call metrics or measures of effectiveness to see how our assistance dollars have been applied. For example, taking a look at judicial institutions, trying to help prosecutors be able to better bring those traffickers and money launderers to justice. So we've seen, unfortunately, in the case of Mexico, which is the one I'm most familiar with and I'm very disturbed by, is the few handful of cases that have been opened and prosecuted by their FinCEN, which is their financial intelligence unit. The laws exist, but you and I know until you actually have the application of the law, it doesn't have the impact and desired effect that it was intended to have. So these are ways that we try in bilateral relations to discuss common interests, common missions. The entire region of the Western Hemisphere obviously looks at the scourge of drug trafficking as not just having physical effects on the population, since it's also so related not just with corruption, but with high levels of violence. But it also affects the economy. What we have is a parallel illicit economy that you all alluded to in your opening remarks that actually takes away and detracts from the illicit economy. And what's even more disturbing, that you have a younger population that is not as attuned to countering corruption because they've been living with it and have seen, sadly, how those who engage in criminal activities and engage in corruption benefit from it,
They've
both
gotten
financially and in terms
acclimated,
of
you could
power.
say.
Yeah, it's
Let
sad
me
to
interrupt
say.
you, and so I have a chance
Sure.
to ask Mr. McDaniel of what we can do in Congress to provide HIDAs the additional tools and authorities they need to be more aggressive on the financial side as opposed to the drug distribution side.
Thank you, sir. What you guys could do is as far as we need additional resources, especially for those investigational databases that we are talking about. And the biggest thing is just arm us with the continued collaboration with our state and local partners to address the money laundering. We have 17 out of our 33 HIDAs actually have dedicated money laundering squads. And I think that's something we could expand out on. And some of those HIDAs have multiple units. That's all they do is just money laundering. And matter of fact, in 2020, the HIDA program took away from these cartels and drug organizations $827 million and $176 million in other assets. And I think you could see those numbers increase a lot with
Thank
extra
you.
resources.
Ms. Kumar, please go ahead, but also I was going to ask you next, and my time is short, so please make your answers short so I can
no.
turn to Chairman Grassley. But I want you to also focus on what role you think we should demand in the National Drug Control Strategy for anti-money laundering activities.
Absolutely. I will go quickly in the interest of time. I was going to suggest that on the anti-corruption side, the U.S. could strengthen anti-corruption provisions within free trade agreements. Now they are broad and loose, but for example, in the U.S. free trade agreement with Peru, there were very specific requirements to target the illicit trade of timber, and there was supply chain accountability, including the provision of beneficial ownership information that was demanded. And I think that would be a very specific measure. Second, to follow up on what was just said, is that within FinCEN, it would be helpful to set up a national AML academy that can provide specific training for both state and local law enforcement, and sort of allowing FinCEN to directly serve in the role in the National Drug Control Strategy would enhance their ability to tie what we have, the illicit finance angle, to the ongoing problems that we have in terms of tackling and enforcing drug issues.
Presumably, Mr. McDaniel, your HIDA colleagues would enjoy that training and appreciate it. Let me turn to Chairman Grassley and then Senator Cornyn.
I'm going to start out with Professor Realio to ask you about what is the extent of Chinese criminal organizations' relationship to the Mexican cartels, and why is it important for policymakers to understand China's role? And I don't know if that's government's role or Chinese criminal elements' role as part of the economics of cartels.
Fantastic question. So we know that not just precursor chemicals that are critical for all types of drugs, but particularly fentanyl that is poisoning our population originates in China. And what we've seen, interestingly, with all the US measures to try to curb the physical sending of fentanyl directly into the US through the postal system, the Chinese have adapted to it, and that's why most of the fentanyl is now being trafficked through Mexico. Mexico and China have very tight and quite expansive trade relations that are now being piggybacked by the movement of these illicit chemicals as precursors as well as fentanyl. And that's where we see the symbiotic relationship between Mexican cartels and now Chinese criminal organizations. But as you well know, nothing happens in China without the Communist Party actually knowing about it. And this is an area that it should be very disturbing to all of us. What we've also seen is that the Chinese are expanding, and this goes beyond drug trafficking. As you know, the Chinese are expanding their tentacles into all of the economies in South America, and they also need to circulate and get paid back for the sale and movement of these precursor chemicals and fentanyl. This is why we've seen Chinese banks and Chinese operators now extending and expanding their money laundering networks in order to circumvent a lot of the measures that have been put in place. So this is an area that we need to focus much more in terms of gathering intelligence, and then more importantly, going after, through prosecutions, the actual brokers as well as the traffickers who are involved in that. And in the US, we've been good at trying to identify these cases and then bring them to justice, but more has to be done.
For Kumar and Hanicek, it's my understanding that bad actors are increasingly facilitating their operations through cryptocurrency. What advantages or disadvantages does cryptocurrency offer drug cartels as compared to something more old-fashioned like cash smuggling, et cetera?
Thank you, Senator. That's an excellent question. The first advantage that cryptocurrency would offer is that it allows you to be outside the purview of the financial system, which means there are no AML controls. No one's asking you uncomfortable questions. Now, the downside of it is if you are a drug trafficker, your ultimate aim is to bring the money back into fiat currency, which is to turn it back into dollars that are usable, where you can buy real estate, you can invest it in a whole host of things. Now, the problem is, as valuable and as much attention as cryptocurrency is getting, the truth is that within the financial system and within the trade system, there are just so many more easier loopholes to exploit that the challenges with cryptocurrency, including the volatility, can act as a deterrent to long-term investment by drug cartels in that sector. And if we were to prioritize resources, I would say the traditional methods that include abuse of the financial and trade system, bulk cash smuggling, TBML, real estate, private equity, that's where our focus should be.
I would just like to concur with Ms. Kumar and just reiterate that we have the tools that we need and the right approach already. We can't be distracted by this new methodology for money laundering. We already know what things we have to do in place, as Ms. Kumar mentioned, in terms of approaching real estate, tackling beneficial ownership opacity, and moving through the private investment sector. One thing that Congress should absolutely avoid doing, though, is to make sure that they avoid implementing specialized rules that might confuse design choices specifically inherent to cryptocurrency that are easily used and leveraged to evade detection and are meant for anonymity with things that seem like innovation. And so in approaching an anti-money laundering strategy to tackle this new methodology, we really should focus and go back to basics.
I think in 22 seconds I can get this question into Mr. McDaniel. What is law enforcement seeing as the most impactful and threatening changes by cartels and how they're trafficking drugs and evading the law?
The biggest things we're seeing and the most alarming is the partnership between Chinese organizations getting the precursor chemicals down, primarily the Sinaloa and the CJNG cartels, and that you actually have Chinese nationals in the labs helping them make methamphetamine and fentanyl, and it's very alarming, the increases in fentanyl we're seeing everywhere across the United States.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me turn to Senator Cornyn and then Senator Hassan, and I We have a vote both on the floor and in finance, and so I may ask Senator Hassan to close out the hearing when she's done with her questioning. So let me just take this opportunity to thank the witnesses. You've been extremely helpful, and we will follow up. Senator Cornyn and Senator Hassan.
Let me address my first question to Professor Realio, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. With a name like mine, you're sensitive about people who mispronounce your name, but I want to ask you about the precursor issue. A year or more ago, Bloomberg did an investigative report about the role of a chemical manufacturer headquartered in the United States named Avantor that was selling through licensees in Mexico portable containers convenient for drug manufacturing of acetic anhydride. Acetic anhydride, I understand, is actually banned in some countries officially, for example, in Afghanistan, which is a premier heroin exporter in Asia. But to what extent do we have a problem with American companies that are connected with chemical manufacturing that either know or should know that their product is being used as a precursor for the manufacture of illegal drugs?
You've identified one of the great loopholes when countries are trying to control precursor chemicals. As you know, there are different combinations of precursor chemicals, and some of them don't fall under the jurisdiction of laws that are implemented, for example, in Mexico or here in the United States or in Peru. The other thing is this also has to do with dual use issues. So a lot of the chemicals are used for legitimate purposes, but obviously the chemists who are now really expanding as we see the explosion of synthetic drugs are finding ways to go around and circumvent this. But we have to hold American companies and their subsidiaries actually accountable to the fact that these are inputs into these lethal drugs that are arriving in the United States and killing our population. So this is where we need to work with the other countries to make sure that they have the same list of banned precursor chemicals. You just mentioned that example of Afghanistan is a very timely one. But many of these companies, it's hard for them to keep up with the local laws in the countries where they have subsidiaries. And that's a huge loophole that many are exploiting.
Professor, I'd like to have my chief counsel reach out to you and for specific action items. I do think this is a huge loophole. Obviously, criminal organizations are not going to comply with our laws, but they will exploit vulnerabilities, and it is a big problem, as you say. Mr. McDaniel, thanks for your service. It's good to see you here today. My question has to do with the drugs that are flowing across the border. It strikes me, to use maybe a bad football analogy, that the offensive line has penetrated our defensive line and is now in our backfield, which is where Haidas primarily operate once the border is penetrated and the drugs have made their way into the interior of the United States. We've heard the number 100,000 plus Americans dying of drug overdoses last year alone, with the overwhelming majority of those drugs coming across the border, whether they come from Mexico or Central America or somewhere else. It's an extraordinarily profitable business, and obviously there's unfortunately demand for that. But we've had 2 million people show up at the border, including unaccompanied children and families during a pandemic, and I know the Border Patrol has been overwhelmed in their to try to process and deal with this flood of humanity. But the fear is, and what they've reported to me, is that once they are processing migrants or feeding formula or changing diapers, that's when the drug cartels exploit that vulnerability. Has that been your experience? And could you share with us your views on that?
Yes, it's definitely a concern that we need to be looking at, because while the Border Patrol is tied up, we are seeing, and I personally have seen tours where there's large amounts of illegal aliens carrying drugs, and they're going down the power lines of ranches. They're They're actually taking over ranches of ranchers that own property that don't actually go there often. It's just an investment, and we're seeing real big problems. We've been actually dealing with some of the large ranches down there where we have immigrants also given a coastal threat and coming in by boat and dropping them off above the inland U.S. Border Patrol checkpoints.
So would you agree with me that people who see illegal immigration or the humanitarian crisis at the border but don't recognize the huge vulnerability that presents for illegal importation of narcotics and other drugs, that they're only seeing part of the problem?
I would agree with that, sir. And it's something we are trying to address in lots of different ways through the HIDA program.
Well, I know notwithstanding your best efforts, and I applaud what you and the folks in the HIDA task forces do, I think we're fighting a losing battle, tragically.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, and I want to thank you and Co-Chair Grassley for holding this hearing, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for your work and for your testimony. I want to start with a question to you, Director McDaniel, and Senator Grassley covered some of this, and there may be some overlap here as we've come in and out, so my apologies if I'm asking you all to be repetitive, but I come from New Hampshire, which has been very, very hard hit by the fentanyl epidemic in particular. But in my state and all across the country, we are seeing a rise in counterfeit pills that are laced with illicit drugs, and they're almost indistinguishable from legitimate medication. Last fall, I urged the DEA to take further action to address the danger of counterfeit pills. Consumers may think they are buying real medicine, but often wind up with fake pills laced with fentanyl or now methamphetamines. In 2021, the DEA seized over 20 million counterfeit pills, many of which contained a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl. How is HIDA helping federal, state, and local law enforcement tackle the developing threat of counterfeit pills?
First of all, I agree with you. I cannot personally tell the difference between counterfeit and real, and our investigators can't either. And we are actually, the HIDA program, especially up in your area up there in New Hampshire, they've done, you had law enforcement coming in and going, guys, we can't continue to do the same thing over and over, and we have to actually do something different. And it was the chief of police sitting there with federal people in your state, and they were actually saying, we got to think out of the box. And they actually developed strategies that were more of, we're working with treatment and prevention more than we ever have.
Yeah.
And I would say in all my years of law enforcement, I never thought I'd say this, but I definitely say we can't arrest our way out of this problem. And it's through innovative strategies that were developed up in New England HIDA in your area and New York, New Jersey HIDA that is actually called the overdose response that has gone, ONDCP has sent it out nationwide. It's part of all the HIDAs now, and I'm really happy about what it's doing.
Well, I appreciate that, and I take it, Ms. Kumar, you'd like to respond to this too. So I will just say quickly, law enforcement has been extraordinary, both in their efforts to combat the cartels and the supply, but also in understanding the seed of the demand and really urging us to do more treatment and recovery. So it's been a real partnership, and I'm extraordinarily grateful to them. Ms. Kumar, what did you want to say?
No, I just wanted to add that, Director McDaniel's raised sort of very important issues, but one thing that we've noticed that a lot of these pill presses are coming in from China.
Yeah.
And so our recommendations on the value of the Corporate Transparency Act and beneficial ownership to be able to track who owns the company provides law enforcement and Director McDaniel's the resources to not just have to look at this issue as just an arrest issue, but you can track the money, track the ownership, and then sort of use a targeted sanctions program if necessary.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. We also just have done public outreach to especially make sure teenagers understand that if they buy something on the dark web or on the street, that it may look like a legitimate prescription medication, but it may very likely not be. Professor Realio, I wanted to ask you a question. You noted in your testimony that fentanyl and fentanyl precursor chemicals are often manufactured in China and then shipped to Mexico. You've all talked about that. Mexican drug trafficking organizations then process the fentanyl and fentanyl precursors and smuggle them into the United States. And I've heard from my law enforcement how closely they're seeing that relationship to even doing investigations from New England. As noted by Senator Grassley, in return, Mexican drug trafficking organizations often launder their money through Chinese networks by bank transfers, smuggled bulk cash, or even cryptocurrency. Professor, I know we've talked about this in this hearing, but what more can the United States and Congress do to disrupt the flow of cartel funds to China for money laundering? And then I'll turn to the rest of you if you have anything to add to the testimony you've already provided. Professor?
Sure. To echo, I think that all of our witnesses today have expressed, we are really fighting the question of how we can expand, in the case of the United States, our human and more importantly, financial, and thirdly, the technological resources that we need at FinCEN and through law enforcement and the plethora of other agencies who work in an interagency approach to actually go after the money and then go after the traffickers. These are large networks and they're so innovative. That's something that we saw during the pandemic, is how quickly they were able to adapt. This is the question then how the Mexican cartel started to produce to switch to producing was because of the interruption of the physical trade between China and Mexico. So this is where we're really coming up against the challenge of how do we keep up with the innovations of these TCOs? And then sadly too, they actually take advantage of all the physical wealth they have to avail themselves of new technologies and this conversion of, let's say, laboratories that used to be profiting and producing heroin from poppy to actually synthetic drugs that are more in demand and much more profitable and lower risk. They don't have to deal with issues like the cultivation of poppy in terms of floods or anything else. But this is why we have to actually devote more intelligence resources and law enforcement resources to go after this problem and address this in our bilateral engagement directly with China.
Thank you. And I'll ask any of the three physically in the room if you want to briefly add. Yes, Ms. Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. In the context of the China issue, one thing is also critical to remember is that a lot of the money movements that we are seeing and the use of sort of trade-based money laundering or black market peso exchange is because of currency controls that exist in the country. And the money laundering techniques are a direct result of those currency controls in the country. So ensuring that the US has perhaps a trade transparency unit relationship with China, which we don't currently have, as a way to exchange information, is another way to sort of target this work around currency controls in the country.
Excellent. And Director?
I also want this committee to, if you're not aware, the amazing amount of markup that the cartels are making on fentanyl and the push, what's going on. And a kilo right now in Houston, you can buy a kilo of fentanyl for $30,000. A kilo of fentanyl will actually equate to 1 million milligrams of fentanyl, and you can make 1 million tablets out of that and sell them anywhere from $6.50 to $65 in Houston, equating to a 6 million to a 37 million markup. And the pills that we're seizing in all across the country are usually containing somewhere between 1 milligram and 2 milligrams, more like 1.5, but anything over that is lethal. So just that's why the cartels, I've never seen something with a profit margin like fentanyl, and I don't see them slowing down at all.
It's high profit margin and very easy to smuggle, obviously, and those two things make it just a particularly attractive thing. I want to ask one more question. If Ms. Hanicek, I didn't know if you had anything to add to this discussion.
The only thing I'd add, Senator, is just to add to my colleague's comments about the importance of increasing collaboration. I will just note that as part of the Summit for Democracy, there will be a follow-on cohort led by the United States focusing on anti-money laundering issues. As we're looking forward to that 2.0 Summit for Democracy in December, I really would like to emphasize the importance that the United States increase resourcing not only to its own financial intelligence unit, FinCEN, but also collaborate with financial intelligence units in other countries to make sure that they have the appropriate resourcing that they need to tackle this problem.
Well, thank you. One last question. I'll start with the professor, please, and it's just about the dark web. It's increasingly become one of the dominant marketplaces for illicit drug sales to consumers. Drug sales are facilitated and anonymized on the dark web with payment in cryptocurrency and drugs delivered through the mail. I'm going to be introducing a bill soon with Senator Cornyn, which is aimed at combating drug sales on the dark web and strengthening the authority of the Joint Criminal Opioid Darknet Enforcement, or J-Code, to go after dark web marketplaces. What more can Congress do to combat the use of the dark web and other emerging technologies by drug trafficking organizations? And we'll start with you, Professor.
Sure. First, I applaud your initiative. It's super important, but also we actually have to start with educating our population. What happened during the pandemic, since everyone was online, all of these bad habits, and more importantly, the proliferation of the sale and marketing to our youth of promoting drug use and consumption, that's where we have seen many parents didn't know what their children were doing in their rooms or in the basement. And this is this question about how we have to educate, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. Every single generation is being affected by the opioid epidemic and these counterfeit pills. And this is where education is so important, and all of us can do this in terms of our own individual impact on our communities and in your constituencies. And we've seen too, not just by adding resources, but really advocating these public awareness campaigns. It's even more urgent than it was prior to the pandemic, as we've seen the mental health impact of COVID-19.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add before we close out? Well, with that, I thank you all so much for excellent testimony and very helpful testimony to all of us, and as importantly, all the work that you do. And I look forward to continuing to work with all of you. With that, I'm going to close out this hearing and just say that the record will remain open for 1 week from today if anybody has questions to submit or additional testimony to provide. Thank you all, and with that, we'll close the hearing.